Okay, good afternoon, Year 9. Hopefully you're accessing this via the flipped homework. So this is a commentary on Mother Any Distance. My apologies, I'm very aware that I'm in the camera and I'm trying desperately not to be too embarrassed. So, this poem is by a poet called Simon Armitage, and it's important to remember that he is writing now. So he's not one of these poets that make you read who's dead or who's writing about a very long time ago. He's writing about today. Some of my favourite poems that we haven't studied yet include one called Out of the Blue, which he wrote about the tragedy of 9/11. And it's a beautifully written poem which you can access via a read version online on YouTube. If you get a chance, look at it, it's beautiful. So he writes about stuff that's happening to us now. And he tends to write about the human relationship. So his big idea is that what's really important in life is the relationships we have with other people. So Mother Any Distance is a poem about the relationship, probably obviously, between Simon Armitage and his mum, or at least that's what we imagine, or that's what the imagined relationship is within the poem. Whether you think it's actually him and his mum, or if you think it's about mothers and sons generally, is really very much up to you. And that's the joy of poetry, obviously, that you can interpret it any way you like. So let's start with stanza number 1. 4 lines long. In fact, all of them are about 4 lines, although it seems to expand as you go through the poem if you look at it on the page, which hopefully we'll come back to later and we'll look at why that's important. So it reads, Mother, any distance greater than a single span requires a second pair of hands. You come to help me measure windows, palmates, doors, the acres of the walls, the prairies of the floors. So his first stanza starts off by setting the scene very much. So this isn't just about a mother and her son. It's about a mother and her son at that stage where the boy is becoming the man, where the son is leaving home. So he's no longer going to be under her roof. He's no longer going to be, strictly speaking, her responsibility. And he starts off by talking about distances, which is going to be important. So when he lived at home, his mum was only ever upstairs or in the kitchen and he was in the living room, or they weren't very far apart. But now he's moved out of home, there is going to be a bigger distance between them. And so he starts talking about distances. Mother, any distance greater than a single span requires a second pair of hands. So it's talking about how nobody lives alone. We all require help. So if you're going to measure a distance that's greater than the span, you need more hands to measure the space. And because of the setup, so this is a young man moving out of home and moving into his own house for the first time, measuring is an important image that's used throughout the poem. And this idea of handspan first makes it very human, makes it very easy to visualise the spaces. So you can see his hands, and then you can literally visualise his mother's hands, like the next lot of space along. And it's this idea that it requires it, that it's not possible to do it on your own. That's really important. But right at the end of that stanza, he starts moving away from the literal. So he starts off very literal and then he starts moving away from it. And you have very real things in the list on line 3. Windows, helmets, doors. So 3 very concrete, very real things. Then he takes a step beyond that and he starts using imagery that reminds us of boyhood and of childhood and of adventure. He talks about the acres of the walls, acres being a large plot of land, as in this country, how we measure land. So suddenly you've got something very physical, like a wall. I'm sat in the office now, I can see the wall in front of me. And he's expanding this idea, so it's much, much bigger than that. It's an acre of space instead, so it's a huge, huge space. And by doing that, he takes this literal idea of measuring together, him and his mum measuring together, measuring this space, and inserts into it ideas of childhood and adventure and going out and playing and being out in the fields and exploring. So you've got the sense of huge space, so it's an intimidating space, but you've also got that sense of adventure, like it's a huge space you can go and explore, so you've got layers of meaning being built in. And then he develops that idea by talking about the prairies of the floors. Now the prairies are really interesting. If you're into your westerns, you'll know about the prairies. If you're into American exploration, when they went out west, you'll know about the prairies, but this idea that they are wide open spaces that can be farmed and can be explored and can be ploughed up and then are being essentially stolen from the Native Americans. And there's all this wonderful history that goes in with it. But when Simon Armitage was growing up, very particularly, it was about this sense of adventure and exploration. So you've got the prairies of the floors. So it develops even more that sense of adventure and makes it almost, I'm going to go with a big word here, cinematic. So it's like being in the cinema. It's encouraging you to imagine this huge open space in front of you. And for people of a certain age, it will invoke the idea of the Western and the Western movie and this huge open prairie. So he starts off his poem very normal, measuring just small spaces, and then grows the space and moves from the literal to the metaphorical to really push the boundaries of the space that he's moving into. He's not a boy anymore, he's going to become a man. The second stanza continues. You at the zero end, so it's that image of measurement. So we've gone from hands to measuring with a measuring tape. She's at the zero end of this measuring tape that's going to be pulled out between them as they measure the house. So you at the zero end, and then he says, and me with the spool. So here's his mum, this is him, and he's pulling out me with the spool, recording length, reporting meters, centimetres back to base, then leaving up the stairs. The line still feeding out, unreeling the years between us. This is the image that he's gone with. Off it goes as I go up the house. Now, interestingly, it starts off with very concrete, literal meaning. So, you at the zero end of the tape, you're my beginning, but also you're holding the tape. And then he's the spool, and off he goes. And he's recording and reporting as he goes. So he's always coming back to tell her as a child. He's always going off into the big wide world and coming back, and going off and measuring something else and coming back. And that's like childhood, it's like growing up. You always go off and then you come back. So like a day at school, you go off, you find out something new and amazing, and you come back home, and over dinner you report to mum and dad what's happened. So it's that idea of childhood being that sense of going and measuring the world around you and finding out what it's like and coming back to mum all the time. So recording and reporting are significant words in those first two lines. And he talks about the minutiae of detail he goes into. He talks about the centimetres, the little details. And he comes back and tells her everything. And then you've got this one word, leaving, on a line on its own. It's a deliberate choice because that's what he's doing. He's leaving his mum, measuring tape down the bottom. There she is, holding the tiny end. And he's off, he's going into the world on his own, moving into house on his own, being his own man, being his own person. And then right at the end of this stanza, you get some beautiful imagery. And it's possibly my favourite use of metaphor in poetry ever, because I just think it absolutely says or contains the message of the poem. So he uses single words, anchor, one-word sentence, and then he uses another word, kite, another one-word sentence. And the mother, in my interpretation of this poem, is the anchor. She is the solid thing holding him down. She is the thing that's stopping the storm from tearing him off. She's heavy, she's weighty, she's almost a chain around his leg, but not quite. She's still safety, she's still security, she's an anchor. But she's very much holding him. And then he moves away from that image to kite, and he wants to be free, and he sees his childhood as this great adventure off into the sky. And obviously a kite is a very evocative image because it reminds us of childhood and childhood play. For me, very specifically, the kite reminds me of playing in Devon with my granddad and my big brother. My granddad was teaching us how to fly kites when we were little, and he'd done the big spiel, like you have to hold on very carefully and you should never let go. And then off Tim went and he played with the kite and he loved it, and then Tim brought the kite back to granddad. Granddad was holding on to it, go, don't let go, Jonathan. At me, and then of course as soon as he's done this and waving it in his hand, he lets go and the kite is off and it's lost and we never get it back. And there's something about the image of a kite and the potential for loss that's really important here. The same with anchor, because obviously if you don't get your anchor down and then there's a storm, you're likely to lose the boat. It can be very dangerous. With a kite, there's always that potential for it to completely disappear and for you to lose it forever, because if the wind is strong or if you let go. So with both of those images, there's a real sense of someone holding on, someone being secure, someone being safe for you so that you can go off and adventure either on the high seas or in the skies, depending on which one you're talking about, but also the potential for loss. And the anchor is this really strong, firm image, and that really sort of evokes the relationship that I think the mother has with him. And then the kite is him, and he's the one tugging to be free, tugging to be let go, tugging to find the big wide world out there, the prairies, the acres. I suppose interestingly, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but in line 2 of stanza 2, he talks about centimetres back to base, which is another childhood or boyhood image. Base, obviously, where soldiers go back to for safety and security. Base camp on Everest is where the climbers and mountaineers go back for safety and security. So base is both about adventure, and very much in the boyhood, childhood sense of adventure, but also it's about security and safety, and it's the same in the images of anchor and kite. There's security and there is safety, but there's also risk and adventure, and those ideas are really important to the poem. Because of course this is a boy who suddenly found himself as a man about to go into the big wide world and start for himself. In the final stanza, you have this phrase, I spacewalk through the empty bedrooms, climb the ladder to the loft, to breaking point where something has to give. And what's really interesting, I think, here is that with the first 2 stanzas, you start very literal, and then in the final line, you get the metaphorical, or the bigger ideas. But with this one, you start with the big idea. You start with spacewalking, and of course astronauts were boyhood heroes. They were these incredibly brave, intelligent scientists who were off adventuring into space. So he starts with the metaphorical, with the adventure, with the boyhood dream, spacewalking, and then brings you back down to climbing a ladder in the loft, and to the very real image of breaking points. The mum's down one end, holding on to the bottom of the measuring tape, and he imagines himself as climbed all the way up to the top of the house. And at that point, this measuring tape is going to snap, it's going to break. And he says this very, very direct line, where something has to give. And it's his relationship with his mum. At some point, his mum has to let go. At some point, the measuring tape has to break. At some point, it all has to give, and he has to be his own man. 2 floors below, and here she is, his poor mum in this image he writes for us. 2 floors below, your fingertips still pinch the last 1/100th of an inch. So mum's got just the tiniest grasp on his life now, just the tiniest influence. And I reach towards the hatch that opens on an endless sky. And here's that wonderful image of life when you're young. It's endless, it's so much potential, there's so much adventure to be had. But he finishes, interestingly, with a contrast. This hatch opens onto the world, so almost like he's a spacewalker. Out opens the hatch, and there's that element of danger that's been all the way through it. He knows that on his own he's going to fall or fly on his own. So if he falls from this hatch, the suggestion is going to die and it's all going to go horribly wrong. But there's also the potential for flying. He might, when he opens this hatch, find that he's going to succeed amazingly on his own and have a wonderful life. And that essentially is why his mum has to let go. Because if mum is still holding on to the last 100th of an inch, he's never going to find out. He's never going to be his own man. He's never going to go off into the world and do his own thing and either be successful, so fly, or be unsuccessful, fall. It's a beautifully straightforward poem in terms of the language that's been chosen. The big ideas underneath it are boyhood and the images that he associates with his boyhood. So you just have to get your head around those bits, I think. The ideas of acres, prairies, base camp, the anchor, the kite, the spacewalking. If you can get your head around those, that pattern of language within this poem, I think it's beautiful and very honest. He left his mum, he needs her help, he's leaving home for the first time, he's scared, he's apprehensive, he's anxious, but he's ready.